All right. If you are a kid and you're still upstairs, can you raise your hand for me? All right. There's a couple of words that I want you to pay attention to today while we go. One is Passover. Can everybody say Passover for me? Passover. And if you are a little kid, say it louder than everybody else. Passover. Good job. All right. So the question is, what is Passover? And that's why I'm telling you right now, because if you're a little kid, or if you're new, you might not know what Passover is. Passover is an event that happened in history that points to something future in Jesus. And Passover is when God was defeating the Egyptian gods. When Yahweh was defeating the Egyptian gods, one of those was that Pharaoh was to be the god that controlled chaos. And so his line was supposed to continue to control chaos. And God was defeating them. Pharaoh would make a nightly journey through chaos and wake up every morning. And when he woke up every morning, the sun would come up. When Pharaoh would fight chaos at night, the sun would go down. So if the sun doesn't come up, has Pharaoh succeeded? No. The ninth plague is no sun, darkness, right? God is telling Pharaoh, you do not know who you are fighting. You think you make a daily fight against chaos? You can't fight chaos. I set chaos. And Jeremiah says, I set the sea to come up to the seashore and no more. Chaos can only do what I allow it. So Passover is when a lamb was shed and that blood was put on the doorposts and allowed the firstborn to live, which points to Jesus, who he was the lamb that was shed that allows us to live. So, Passover. If you were a little kid, Passover points to Jesus, and it points to a promised rest. There is another word that I want you to pay attention to. So we have Passover and we have Sabbath. Have you ever heard of Sabbath before? Yeah, if you're a little kid, you probably haven't. Sabbath is a weekly day of rest, and for the Jews, they observed it on Saturday, and for us, we observe it on Sunday. So every Sunday is called a Sabbath rest. So I'm going to talk about that. So Passover, Sabbath, and the third word that I want you to pay attention to is rest. So if you hear these words, tap your mom's shoulder or squeeze her hand every time you hear them, okay? What words are we paying attention to? Passover, Sabbath, and rest. All right, so I'm going to give you a heads up. If you are a kid, I'm going to say one here soon, okay? So let your mom know, or the person you're sitting next to. Why do we keep the Passover? So this is where you tap her on the leg or something like that and let her know, we just said Passover. So why do we keep the Passover? This was back in Christmas time. We talked about this a little bit because it is a sign. That's what God says. It is a sign. And this word sign means flag, beacon, evidence, or sign. Hence the word sign. So if I was one of the 12 tribes and I was to go out to battle, I would carry my flag for my tribe, right? It was a sign for my tribe, and we know of this. Why do people get so upset when somebody's burning the American flag? Because it's not a flag, because it's a symbol of all of America, and we feel like they're attacking America. But why do they burn the flag? Because they are saying there's something wrong with America, and they're letting us know by burning the flag and saying something has happened to us and we need to change. And so it is a sign, it is evidence, it's a reminder for us, and this is what we're told in Exodus 13. And on that day you are to explain to your son, this is because of what Yahweh did for me when I came out of Egypt. It shall be a sign for you on your hand, and a reminder on your forehead that the law of Yahweh is to be on your lips. For with a mighty hand the Lord brought you out of Egypt. Therefore you shall keep this ordinance at the appointed time year after year. So every single year we are to observe the Sabbath. And if you were a little kid, you said, oh, that's the word I'm paying attention to, Sabbath. So you observe the Sabbath year after year. Every year you observe it because it reminds us of what God has done. And for the New Testament writers, they associate us as those that were brought out of Egypt, those that were rescued. And so when we say that God brought us out of Egypt, that includes us. He rescued us from the domain of wickedness. And so we do this again and again and again so we can remind ourselves who God is and what He has done for us. So why are we to keep the Sabbath holy? The same type of idea. Why do we keep the Sabbath? Because it is to remind us of what God has done and who we are now as a result. But only the Sabbath doesn't happen once a year, it happens every week, right? Every week we remind ourselves what God has done, who we are, and the promise that He has for us. Exodus 31, and the Lord said to Moses, this is when God gave Moses the 10 Commandments. But Moses went down, saw the people, got mad, smashed the tablets, right, and went back up to plead for the people. This is the second time that God is giving the commandments. The people have already said, yes, we will follow you. You will be our God, and we will be your people, and we will follow your commandments. And it did not take very long for them to not follow the commandments. So God tells Moses this. You are to speak to the people of Israel and say, above all, you shall keep my Sabbaths. For it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I, Yahweh, sanctify you. You shall keep the Sabbath because it is holy for you. It is a sign forever between me and the people of Israel, that 6 days Yahweh made the heaven and earth, and on the seventh day He rested and was refreshed. So God made the earth in 6 days. And if you have ancient Israelite or ancient Near Eastern understanding, 6 days is how long it takes to make a temple. And then seventh day is when God moves into the temple and He dwells there. And He lives in His temple. So He made His temple, and then He dwelt in His temple, and He rested in His temple. You know what it's like to be done with your work and want to come home and snuggle in on your lazy boy and rest, right? You find rest in your home. You know what it is when you go out somewhere else and you're sleeping in somebody else's bed or in a hotel bed, and then you just long to come back to your bed so that you can find rest. And that's what God has done. He created the world, the universe, as His temple and dwelt in it. And He created the Garden of Eden as His holy of holies, and He invited Adam and Eve to live there with Him. And so this Sabbath is pointing to the rest that God had put into all of creation, and it points to the future when we will rest with Him for all of eternity. So let's go ahead and watch this video. I think it should work.
The number 7 is a big deal in the Bible.
Yeah, in biblical Hebrew, the word 7 is connected to the idea of fullness or completeness.
And that's something we all long for, but don't often experience. Instead, we find ourselves working endlessly, fighting back chaos with no real rest.
Yes. Now keep all that in mind as we turn to Genesis 1 in the Bible. It begins with darkness and disorder, but then God speaks to bring about light and order so that life can flourish.
And this happens over the course of 6 days.
Each day is marked with the phrase, there was evening and there was morning. But on the seventh day, something special happens.
God stops and rests.
Right. Creation is brought to its completion on the seventh day. And that phrase, there was evening and there was morning, it doesn't appear on day 7.
It's like a day with no end.
On the seventh day, God's presence fills his creation. The land provides for all of God's creatures, including humans, who are appointed to rule the world with God forever.
Kings and queens of the seventh day rest. I can get into that.
But the humans are deceived by a dark power, and they forfeit that rest. They're exiled into the wilderness, where they have to work as slaves to the land.
Until they die and return to the dust from which they came.
But God wants to restore humanity back to that seventh day rest. So he chooses to give the family of Israel that experience of ultimate rest so they can share it with others.
But how? They're in Egypt, slaves to an oppressive empire who's grinding them into the dust.
So God confronts Egypt and he liberates the Israelites, taking them through the darkness and chaos on the way to the promised land.
Now, while they're on their way, they find themselves in the wilderness. It's easy to get lost, life is a struggle. They're not in the land of rest yet.
But while they're on the way, God invites them in the wilderness to start living as if they're in the promised land.
But how do you practice the future rest in the wilderness?
Well, God tells them that every seventh day they are to stop their work, or in Hebrew, to Shabbat, so that they can rest and enjoy God's good world.
So take a whole day to live as if the ultimate rest has already come.
Yeah, this is the Sabbath, celebrated every week on the seventh day. But there's more. The Sabbath is just one of 7 festivals that Israel practiced every year, each one anticipating that seventh day rest.
That is a lot of sevens.
And there's even more. Every 7 years, the Israelites were to liberate slaves, forgive debts, and let the land rest for a whole year. And then, every 7 times 7 years was the ultimate seventh day rest, called the Year of Jubilee. If anyone had lost their land or gone into debt, all was forgiven, everything restored.
Wow, so the Sabbath, these feasts, the Year of Jubilee, it's all pointing towards the hope of future rest.
Right. Now, when the Israelites went into the land, they forgot their God, and so they forfeited their chance for rest in the promised land.
They're exiled and enslaved again by an oppressive nation, led back into a world of chaos and disorder.
But Israel's prophets said that their exile would end one day, and that the ultimate jubilee of freedom and rest would come, but generations go by, and they're still waiting.
It's at this dark point in the story that Jesus appears, and he launches his public mission on a Sabbath day.
Yeah, he read aloud from the scroll of Isaiah, saying that it was time for all captives and slaves to be released because this was the year of the Lord's favor.
What did he mean, this is the year of the Lord's favor?
He was talking about the ultimate jubilee.
Also, Jesus is claiming that seventh day rest would come through him.
Right, he said that he was the Lord of the Sabbath, and he confronted disorder and darkness in all of its forms, liberating people from sickness, sin, even from death itself.
Yet, Jesus was killed, so even his work was undone.
Well, it seemed that way. But notice, Jesus timed his death to take place at the end of the week. His body rested in a tomb during the Sabbath, and on the 8th day, he rose from the dead.
Oh wait, the 8th day? You mean the first day of a new week?
Exactly. Jesus' resurrection was like the first day of a new creation, where God's light and life broke into the darkness.
So because of the resurrection, we have hope in God's promise of future rest. But we're not there yet. It's like we're still in the wilderness, where we experience struggle and pain.
But as we journey towards that ultimate seventh day, Jesus invites us to experience a taste of real rest now by following him. Or in his words, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest."
So what I'm trying to talk about today is, what is the sign of the Sabbath? What is it pointing to? Why is it so important to God that we keep it? That God sanctifies us. What does it mean that God sanctifies us? Why is that the promise that God gives to Moses? What does sanctifying do? Sanctification allows us to be in his presence. See, God set up the temple system with the sacrifices, and the primary thing that the sacrifices did is they cleansed the temple, because we as sinners infect the entire world with sin, just like a disease. If you go to the hospital, and if you are sick, they make you cover up so that you don't get somebody there sick who has a compromised immune system. Or if they have some sort of sickness, right, and they leave, what do they do to the room? They disinfect the room. And God is dwelling on earth in his temple, and we keep infecting all of his stuff. And so they are supposed to do the sacrifices to sanctify his stuff so that he can continue to dwell with us. And Hebrews says, we know that the blood of lambs and goats doesn't take away sins, because those don't sanctify us. What did you do with the sins? You put them on the scapegoat and they left, right? And so what did Jesus do? He comes and he says, I'm going to sanctify you. So now you're not carrying around that disease. And you can now enter into God's presence because you have been sanctified. So before, the lamb and the goats were sanctifying the temple so that God could be in our presence, because we continued to infect everything. And then God says, I'm going to change it so that you can be into my presence, because then you can rest with me. What is found in his presence, David says it's the blessed life. The blessed life is found in his presence. That we get to be in his presence and don't have our sins counted against us. What is found in his presence? Eternal life is found in his presence. And then what are we told in Exodus is found in his presence? Rest and refreshment. Jesus says, all you who are burdened and heavy laden, come to me and find rest. For my burden is light and my yoke is easy. And what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to walk alongside Jesus as he teaches you how to live life. Ceasing from work to find rest in him. What do I mean when I say work? Why did I put that in quotes? Because the word that caught my attention in that video was fighting against chaos. The very first time that you saw that guy with a boulder, they used the word fighting against chaos, because we feel it. Life is always wanting to come crashing down on us, and we're always fighting against it, fighting against it, fighting against it. And he says, 6 days shall you work, but on the seventh you shall stop. Because it is to point to that God is the one who ultimately fights against chaos. Pharaoh isn't the one who keeps chaos at bay. We're not the ones who keep chaos at bay. God is. He says, I set the seashore, and the waters can only come this far and no farther. So the Sabbath rest is to remind us that God is the one who gives us rest. We aren't the ones who give us rest. Exodus 20:11, this is out of the Ten Commandments. For in 6 days Yahweh made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. But on the seventh day he rested. Therefore Yahweh blessed the Sabbath day and set it apart as holy. And what does holy mean? Its basic understanding is to be set apart. And so you have 6 days where you're working, and then you have a seventh day that is different, that is set apart, is unique, where you have stopped fighting against chaos, and you instead rest in the promise that God gives you, that he says, I control chaos, I give rest, you don't find rest, I give it to you. And this word rest, well, there's two kind of main words for rest in the Hebrew Bible. One is Shabbat, which is the Sabbath, and this word for rest simply means to stop working. Like when you clock out at work, you're done, right? Your work no longer has control over you, you're done, right? Unless you happen to be on call for the hospital or something like that, right? But even then, you still get those times in which you are free from being on call for the hospital, where you have clocked out, and those worries should not be coming in on you, right? So you've stopped so that you can do what? so that you can knock, which means to dwell or to settle. And this word here, which means on the seventh day he rested, is the Hebrew word knock, which means he dwelt in his temple, or he rested in his temple. We have to stop in order to rest, to stop working and truly rest in God's presence. God invites us into his dwelling, into his abode to find rest. And he says that he has now made his abode in us. Right? We know that because we're also told that we are his temple, that his Spirit has dwelt in us. And he is building us up, as Peter says, as, holy stones to build up God's temple. That God is pointing all of this to that I have a future rest planned for all eternity. For in 6 days Yahweh made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, but on the seventh day he rested, he dwelt, he abode in his house. So our future promise of eternal rest and dwelling with God. That's what the Sabbath day is pointing us to. When we come and we worship together, we are worshiping the God who gives rest. We are worshiping the God who has given rest, who gives rest, and will give eternal rest. In the Septuagint, it says this. This is the same thing. For in 6 days Yahweh made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all things in them, and he rested. Only this is a Greek word instead of the Hebrew word, katapao. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right or not. So he rested on the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the seventh day and hallowed it. The reason why I'm going into the Greek is because we're going to go into Hebrews. And I want you to be able to see what the author of Hebrews is trying to tell us, because he keeps using this same Greek word and its sister word to talk to us. Hebrews 4:4. For somewhere he has spoken about the seventh day in this manner, and on the seventh day God rested. In the Hebrew it was knock, but in the Greek katapao. So he rested from all his work. That word to dwell, he dwelt in his temple. And again, as he says in the passage above, they shall never enter my rest. And notice this word here, same English word, rest and rest, but now the Greek word has changed from a verb into a noun. So he did the action of dwelling in his house in the verse above, and now it's talking about his house, or his land, or his abode. And why am I talking about this? What is he talking about here when he says, they shall never enter my rest? He brings them out of Egypt. He brings them into the desert. He makes a covenant with them. They saw how he defeated the Egyptians and destroyed their gods. They saw how he came down with fire and the mountains shook and the clouds and the lightning, and they spoke to them. They saw how he brought them through the Red Sea and opened it up so they could walk on dry land, not just mud, but dry land. How he gave them water, gave them manna, how their clothes didn't wear out. And they get to the border of God's land, the promised land. And they say, let's send 12 spies in. And then they come back. And 2 of them say, we can do this, Caleb and Joshua, and the other 10 says, we can't do this. The sons of Anak are there. These angel-human hybrids, these demigods are there. We can't fight the demigods. And they've forgotten, what did God do? He didn't just destroy demigods. He destroyed the entire gods of the Egyptians. He did all of this, and they forgot. And so, because they didn't believe that God was capable, because they didn't trust God, that he would give them the victory, they said, we're not going to do it, we're going to die. And God says, okay, then you're not going in. You're going to stay in the desert. And you know what it's like. As soon as you tell a kid that they're not going to do something, they decide they're going to do it. And that's what they did. They say, fine, we're going in then. We're going to go in. We're going to do it. And Moses says, you can't go in. God is not going with you. You are going to die. And that's what happened. They went in, and they were killed, and they were routed, and they fled with their tails under their legs back into the desert. And they were not able to enter into the promised land, the land that signified God's rest. It was his land. Which is why when King Ahab says, I want that vineyard, and he goes to the guy and he says, will you sell me your vineyard? And the guy says, I cannot give you my inheritance that Yahweh has given me. Why would I give that to you? This is my promised land. This is the area in which God has given me rest. I can't give it to you. It is his land, and he gave it to me. I'm dwelling with him in his land. And Hebrews 4:10, for whoever enters God's rest, this is the noun, so this is the object, his house, his abode, his land, his dwelling. Also rest, this is the action where we get to participate in resting. And you know what it's like sometimes, how much work it takes to rest, especially like if the Super Bowl's coming up. All of this stuff where you set out all this stuff so that people can come over and rest with you. Hopefully your team wins, because then your rest isn't quite complete. For whoever enters God's rest also rests from his own work, just as God did from his. And then verse 11, let us therefore strive to enter that rest, so that no one may fall by the same sort of disobedience. We have to fight again and again and again to remember who our God is. Because otherwise, like the Israelites, we will see the next new enemy and say it's impossible for God, because we have forgotten. And this is why he tells us to keep the Sabbath week after week after week, so that we go through this pattern of reminding ourselves who our God is, what he has done. We get to participate in that rest now, corporately with other people, because we know one day he will give us ultimate rest. And if we're not doing these things that he's called us to, then when it comes time for us to enter into the land, he says, now here's a battle in which I'm calling you to enter into. Here's some suffering in which I'm giving you to be able to go through. And you say, he can't do it, because I have forgotten who he is. Because we are fickle people. That song says, Lord, I feel it, right? Prone to wander. That's us. That's why he set into creation this pattern of weekly, of yearly, of 7 years, right? Of 49 years, to remind us that his plan for us is to rest with him, to dwell with him. Above all else, keep the Sabbath, for it is my promise to you that I sanctify you, so that you can rest and dwell with me. So it's a promise of future rest. That's what the Sabbath is. And we're going to go back to Hebrews chapter 3, where this idea is starting to come through. And he's reading out of the Psalms, which is where it's talking about how they didn't enter into the land because they were afraid. So their hearts are always going astray, and they have not known my ways. So I swore an oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. Because our hearts forget. And then 18, and to whom did he swear that would never enter his rest? Was it not to those who disobeyed? God says, go in and take the land, for I'm going in there to give it to you. Which means you're going to go in there and fight. Which means you're going to win, because I'm the God who wins this battle for you. And they're like, but we can't fight. When God calls us into something, he calls us to walk alongside him with it. Not to not carry anything, but to follow him as he goes. Verse 1 in chapter 4, therefore, while the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you be deemed to have fallen short of it. Now we who have believed enter that rest. Right? This is one of those promise things where He has put His Holy Spirit in us. He has sealed us until we gain a possession of our inheritance, right? That rest is ours. He has given it to us, and we know it because His Spirit is in us. And He calls us then to participate in that rest. So everywhere we go, we can rest knowing that He's with us because His Spirit is in us, even when everything's falling down around us. And we, like Paul, say, this is too much for me to endure. That's what he tells the Corinthians. Then what does he tell the Romans? I do not count these light and momentary afflictions as anything to be compared to the eternal weight of glory that God has for us. And I think to myself, Paul, too much for you to endure or light and momentary? And it's both. Because compared to all eternity, it's light and momentary. But in the midst of it, it's too much for you to endure. That's what the Israelites said. We can't defeat the sons of Anak. And God's right, says, you're right, you can't. But I'm the one who defeats them. So go with me. And so when it's too much for us to endure, we cry out to Him and we say, we need your help. And He says, that's who I am. In the Psalms, He says, I don't want your sacrifices. I don't want this. I want you to cry out to me. This is what brings me glory. Since then, it remains for some to enter His rest, and since those who have formerly heard the good news did not enter because of their disobedience, God again designates a certain day as today. Today, if you hear His voice, do not harden your hearts. You never know when your last today is. And God says, today is the day. My rest is right there for you to take. Step into it. We're like, and whatever it is, we don't want to go because something else is tying us down. Because of fear or because of something else, we say, I'll do it tomorrow. And we get that parable about the guy who says, I'm going to build for myself all of these grain things and everything like that. And he finally gets it done and he says, tomorrow I'm going to enjoy it all. And God says, you fool, tonight your soul is demanded of you. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken later about another day. We know that the land, His promised land, was not the ultimate fulfillment of rest. Just like the Sabbath day, it pointed to another day. The day in which we get to spend all eternity in eternal rest in God's presence with Him. There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. We know that there remains for us this Sabbath rest. We know that it's in the future, but we know we can experience portions of it now. And so we show up on Sunday, we show up together, we do these things that God has called us to remind ourselves that one day, right? One day we will enter into that rest. Let's strive to enter into that rest. This word strive means to be zealous for it. Let's be zealous, right? But it also means that there is this work that is going to be done, and you think, how do you work to rest? That seems contrary, but it's because our hearts are going to keep wandering, and we're going to have to keep fighting against it, and we're going to have to keep calling for Him to help us remember that He is the God of rest, who gives rest, even when all of life is going against us, that we know He is with us. For whoever enters God's rest also rests from his own work, just as God did from His. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest, so that no one will fall by following the same pattern of disobedience, where we forget who God is, and we do not trust Him, and therefore we disobey. For the Word of God is living and active. Nothing in all creation is hidden from God's sight. You know this passage, right? Where he says, sharper than a two-edged sword, pierces to even the marrow, right? Where we know that we're not holy. And the only way for us to be able to enter into his presence is if God sanctifies us. And the other thing is, sometimes God has to reach down and cut out a portion of you because it is rotting away at your life. And if he leaves it, it will destroy you. And so sometimes he does that. And we're like, I don't like that. But if you know the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Chronicles of Narnia, Voyage of the Dawn Treader, Eustace becomes a dragon. And Aslan calls him up and he says, take your skin off. So he takes his skin off, but he just sheds it like a snake. And the first time he shed it, he's like, oh, I'm a human again. But then he looks down and he sees he's still a dragon with new skin. And Aslan says, you're not going to be able to do it. You need to let me do it because it runs deep. And Aslan takes his claws and it hurts because he's got to peel that hide away. And Eustace knows that it's going to continue to hurt, but he also knows that he doesn't want to remain a dragon forever. And so he lets Aslan peel his skin off so that he can once again be who he is. And so we have this high priest, because that's where he's going next. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to what we profess. That he is our high priest. He is the reason why we have been sanctified. His blood has been sprinkled onto us, signifying our sanctification, our cleansing, and our washing, so that we are made clean. We are holy to be able to enter into his presence. So let us hold firmly to that. Let's not let those sins that so easily entangle us keep us from approaching God's presence thinking that I need to get them off of me. But God says the only way to get them off of you is to enter into my presence. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness, but we have one who was tempted in every way that we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore come boldly until the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace in our time of need. When those sins are weighing you down and have caught you and are pulling you away from God's presence, and you think, I need to take care of it, you're hiding in the darkness. The only way to get those taken care of is to enter into God's presence and say, I need your help. And he says, that's what I need you to do. Call out to me, and I can help you. Approach my throne of grace with boldness, for I have sanctified, I have made you holy to be able to enter into my presence. When you try to do it yourself, you can't. You will die like the Israelites trying to take the land. So let's boldly approach the throne of grace. Hebrews 10. See, Hebrews 4 talks about this high priest and coming boldly. And then it's this question, but can we come boldly? So the author of Hebrews goes through and telling us how Jesus is a high priest unlike any other high priest. Therefore we can trust and we can come boldly. And then he continues his thought of entering into rest in chapter 10. Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way opened up for us through the curtain of his body, and since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a sincere heart in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled to cleanse us from a guilty conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. We know that Jesus' death is the only way for us to enter into God's presence. There is no other way. He is the only way. And we forget because we think, I'm going to clean myself up before I go to God and make this prayer. And we need to remind ourselves that the only way we can even pray to God is because Jesus died for us, and we are now sons, and he hears us because we are sons. And he continues, so let us hold resolutely to the hope we profess. For he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to spur one another on to love and good deeds. Let us not neglect meeting together, as some have made a habit, but let us encourage one another, all the more as you see the day approaching. One of the big things that I see there is neglecting of meeting together. That doesn't mean the Sabbath all by itself, but I think the Sabbath is included in that. This meeting together is meeting together. Everything that includes meeting together is inside of that, one of which is the Sabbath. Where if we don't go through that habit of setting it apart as holy, where we say, this day we have set it up so that we're going to protect it so that the rest of life doesn't creep in on it. Because life is going to keep creeping in on it, and we have to fight that to make it set apart and holy so that we can remember who God is. Because there are going to be times when we don't remember. And that's where our friends come along and spur us on to good works and say, come on, we can do this. We can be Joshua and Caleb to each other. Let's remember who our God is. Remember what He has done. So let us hold resolutely to the hope we profess. And it reminds me of Hebrews 4. It says, there remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. There is a promise that in eternity we will dwell and rest with God. And that comes because of what Jesus has done on the cross for us, because God is the one who does it. He is the one who fights chaos. He is the one who gives rest. And then in verse 14, therefore, since we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold firmly to what we profess. Let us hold resolutely to what we profess. Linking up Hebrews 10 with Hebrews 4. Remember that the Sabbath is pointing to who God is and the type of king that He is and the type of God who He is, that He gives rest. And He's calling us to hold on to who He is, that He gives the victory. And we need to pursue Him and find our help in time of need by boldly approaching the throne of grace through Jesus' blood, because He's the one that sanctified us and made us holy. Let us therefore come boldly unto the throne of grace, to not forget that. Our only hope is in our great high priest. Psalms 95 is what the writer was referencing in chapter 3. This is where it's talking about how the people of Israel did not enter into the land because they were afraid. And Psalms 95 is calling us to remember who our God is, that today is the day to obey and to believe. And how do we do that? He starts out like this. Let us come, let us sing for joy to the Lord. Let us shout to the rock of our salvation. Let us enter His presence with thanksgiving. Let us make a joyful noise to Him in song. Let us boldly approach the throne of grace, knowing that Jesus has made a way for us because He has sprinkled our hearts and washed us clean. So let's remember, let's worship God together and enter into His presence with a joyful noise to Him in song. For Yahweh is great and a great king above all gods. Remember, He defeated the gods of the Egyptians. So our God is above all gods. Nobody can stand against Him. Jesus says, all authority on heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go, and I will be with you even until the end of the age. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Which means victory is ours. It is assured. Because when God's presence goes with us, victory goes with us. Always, even until the end of the age, I will never leave you nor forsake you. And that may mean He calls you to die, because He called a lot of Christians to die. But that doesn't mean you lost. Because His presence has gone with us. Whereas Ezekiel says, I have seen the presence of God leave the temple. I have seen the glory of God that has left the temple. which means the Babylonians are going to come in and they're going to conquer Jerusalem because God's presence is no longer there. But he gives us a promise, I will never leave you. And then verse 6, "Oh come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before Yahweh our Maker. For he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture, the sheep under his care. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts." So he's telling us, who is your God? Who is our God? Who is he? We know who he is. So today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts, as you did in the rebellion. And he's talking about, he uses the place in which they rebelled, and so they called that place rebellion. In the day of testing, and so he's referencing back to the day of testing. And so when they were tested, what did they call that place? Testing. As you did in Meribah, as you did in Massah in the wilderness, where your fathers tested and tried me, though they had seen my work. I don't know if you ever say that. Well, if God would just reveal himself to me, or if he would speak audibly to me, or if he would do this, or if he would do that. Our hearts are prone to wander. They saw it again and again and again. He's with them with fire by night and smoke by day. Moses comes down off the mountain glowing. And they forget who their God is. "So I swore an oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest." So how is the psalmist trying to help us remember to enter into God's rest and not to disobey? By telling us who our God is. And we remind ourselves who our God is, and we bow down and we worship our God so that our hearts are reminded, so that we won't disobey, so we won't rebel. And so don't throw away your confidence. Hebrews 10 says this, "Remember the early days that you were in the light, when you endured a great conflict in the face of suffering." See, what's happening in the book of Hebrews is they want to go back to participating in the Hebrew religion because they are being persecuted. And the author is saying, don't go back. You don't need to offer these sacrifices because you have been sanctified. You're not infecting the temple anymore. Your only hope is in Jesus. There is no other option. And you're wanting to go back to things that don't work because of persecution? Remember what you did to begin with because you knew the love of God. Because it was real to you. And so you said, I'll endure suffering. Remember the early days that you were in the light when you endured a great conflict in the face of suffering. Sometimes you were publicly exposed to ridicule and persecution. At other times you were partners with those who were so treated. You sympathized with those in prison and joyfully accepted the confiscation of your property, knowing that you yourselves had a better and permanent possession. This is what Peter is telling us, that our inheritance is undefilable, imperishable, reserved for us in heaven, that our eternal rest will happen. And your property was a pointing to that. But you know that it is yours because the Holy Spirit has sealed that promise on you. So you can go ahead and let it go because you know what you have. So do not throw away your confidence. It holds a great reward. You need to persevere so that after you have done the will of God, you will receive what He has promised. For in just a little while, He who is coming will come and will not delay. God has set that day. When God decides to return, it will happen. Nothing is going to stop Him. He will come and you will receive your inheritance, and you will rejoice and you will throw your crowns at His feet and you will worship Him as God because that's who He is, and you will see Him face to face, and we will be like Him, for we will see Him as He is. And we think, are you coming? This suffering is too long. This persecution is too long. This chaos crashing in on me is too much. The sound of these waves scare me. And Jesus says to the disciples, "O ye of little faith." That's me. And that's where we need to spur each other on. To say, we can go, you can do it, God is with you. Do you know who He is? The psalmist says it like this: "You've slayed Leviathan, you've cut off his heads." You are the creator of heaven and earth. You have brought us out of Egypt. You have defeated all the gods. All authority on heaven and earth has been given to Jesus. Therefore, go. But my righteous ones will live by faith. This is quoting from the Old Testament. "And if he shrinks back, I will take no pleasure in him. But we are not those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and persevere and who preserve their souls." We know, you know that love. You know what God has done for you. And you say, "I can't give my allegiance anywhere else. I will be like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego." And I will say, "My God is the God of heaven. He's seated above, and He will deliver me from your hands, O King, safely into His hands. I know my inheritance is sure, and He may deliver us from the fire." And He did deliver them from the fire, but He didn't stop them from going through it. They still went through the fire. So why do we keep the Sabbath? So we remember the promise of God, because we are prone to forget it. So we do not shrink back. We are to hold fast to the promise of God. It says that He is an anchor for our soul. It says that hope is an anchor to our soul. We are holding on to Him. In the midst of the storm, we have thrown our anchor and it has landed on Him. And we know we are secure. Even though we can't see Him, even though we can't hear Him, even though He is quiet, and He's not in the fire, and He's not in the wind, and He's not in the earthquake, we know He is with us because He has given us His promise, and His promises never fail. And He says, "You will succeed because I am with you." And it may be that you perish in this storm, but I am bringing you into my rest. Missy Takano says this: "The law of the Sabbath is pure gold. It is not a commandment we are bound to, it is a promise we are invited into." We do not have to show up on Sunday. We get to show up on Sunday. We do not have to worship together. We get to worship together. We do not have to pray together. We get to pray together. We do not have to carry one another's burdens. We rejoice when we carry one another's burdens because we are fulfilling the law of Christ. I'd like us to stand up and we're going to sing a song. We're singing this song here. It talks about a hope for our soul, and it talks about mounting up on wings of eagles. It is not our wings that we mount up on. It is God's wings that we mount up on. In Exodus 19, He says, "You know how I brought you out on wings of eagles out of Egypt." He is the one who rescues us. He is the one who walks with us. He is the one in which we latch our anchor onto and we hold fast to the promise that He has given.